What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for BioShock 2. The BioShock title that tends to fly under the radar a bit more than 1 or Infinite, which made for a game I was very interested in checking out as I play through the series for the very first time. But before we dive into all of that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform. And while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything I cover, there's a video linked in the description below that will go over it, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, with that out of the way, BioShock 2 is an interesting sequel in a lot of ways. You'll often hear people praise the gameplay, though the story seems to have stuck with people a bit less so than its counterparts in the series. And over the course of this review, we're going to try to dive into all of those things, but first and foremost, right here at the beginning, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the development and more technical details of this game, because I'm playing through the remastered version, which is part of a collection that was released, I believe, in 2017, that is all of the games bundled together. When it comes to the development of BioShock 2, it was technically developed by a different studio than the first one. The first one being developed by Irrational Games, however, there was a lot of rocky development times there, which led to a lot of people departing that studio after BioShock 1 was released, with many of them landing with 2K, specifically at one of their studios called 2K Marin, and while other studios from 2K assisted as well, the core team that developed BioShock 2 had a lot of experience working on the first one. But another thing to note here is that BioShock 2 originally launched with a multiplayer mode that was developed by Digital Extremes, a bit separate to the regular gameplay. The remastered version does not include the multiplayer at all, and while the servers for that are still technically up, you'd be hard-pressed to find enough people to actually play them with, so this review is not really going to talk too much about that multiplayer aspect, but for completeness sake, that is a thing that existed that no longer really does, at least with the remastered version. Though speaking of the remaster in particular, it was mostly aimed at graphical updates, and the thing about graphics in general is that graphics are very subjective and not everybody likes the update. But what makes that worse is that for some people, the remaster introduced a lot of instability to the release, which means that even as recently as the past few weeks, you can find reports of people having a lot of trouble running the remastered version specifically, so that's certainly something to watch out for. In my own experience running this on a very high-end modern machine, I didn't really have any issues. The game crashed one time on me, but otherwise it was fine. The game does also use the 2K launcher, as that was added to all of these last year actually, which is certainly kind of annoying, but it's also very unobtrusive. It's mostly just a light version of the launcher that splashes up the 2K logo, and then you just click play, and that's pretty much it. You don't have to log in, make an account, anything like that. So its inclusion is largely pointless, especially since if you're running this game on Steam, it's possible to bypass that completely by setting the launch options appropriately, but certainly something to keep in mind. But with all of that out of the way, let's actually start talking about the story setup for BioShock 2. This, as I'm sure you've seen on screen, sees our return to the city of Rapture. Now, the bulk of the game takes place 8 years after the events of the first game. However, the opening scene takes place a bit before that happened, specifically a little bit before the Civil War that then led into the events of the first game. In this setup scenario, we see our character, a Big Daddy actually, escorting and protecting his little sister before being stopped by a woman named Sophia Lamb, who forces you to relinquish your little sister before also commanding you to kill yourself. Flash forward in time, and our character resurrects, so to speak, and is set on a hunt for our initial little sister, which then spirals into other events. So in this game, we play as a Big Daddy, however, not just any old one. Specifically, we play as Subject Delta, a member of an experimental set of these units known as the Alpha series, and the Alpha series in particular was made to be bonded to one specific little sister and vice versa, as opposed to the more interchangeable setup we see in other parts of the setting, so to speak. And this connection sees us either having to find her or die, against the backdrop of the city of Rapture having come under control of Sophia Lamb. In the absence of Andrew Ryan and Fontaine from the first title, Sophia Lamb Lamb has largely been left to her own devices, and what she's up to specifically I'll leave to your imagination, as I don't want to spoil everything here in case you'd like to play it for yourself, but this accounts for things like how we see more splicers still, how the city itself is managing, etc. And the story, I think, does a good job of bridging all those components. It even explains why we haven't heard of Sophia Lamb up to this point. And when it comes to broad thoughts about the story, I would say that overall, my personal preference, I enjoyed the story of this one more than the first. However, this second story here lacks a lot of the big dramatic moments that the first game had, such as your encounter with Andrew Ryan, though with this being a second outing, I think this game had very large shoes to fill in that regard, and I think it's understandable it fell a little bit short of the very high bar that the first game's narrative set up. But that's not to say it's inferior, simply because the story of BioShock 2 is more about the people of the city of Rapture, whereas the first game was more about the setting and the atmosphere and the city itself. And we even see this reflected in the gameplay of this one, where we are presented with choices throughout the title beyond just saving or harvesting the little sisters, which we'll get to, but we also get to make a few other decisions about how to handle other NPCs we run into, and all of those decisions collectively can inform the ending, which is why BioShock 2 has up to 6 endings, though 3 of them I would say are the primary sort of endings, with some minor variations to each that lead us with a total of 6. Which is especially interesting to note because the next entry in the series, BioShock Infinite, is technically a prequel, though obviously they bounce around time a little bit there, which I'm already aware of. However, in an upcoming BioShock game, theoretically, timeline-wise, they would put it past the events of BioShock 2, which means these endings are likely what we could expect to be continued story-wise. Though obviously this far out, it's impossible to say what they'd keep and what they'd throw away there, but some food for thought. Again though, broadly speaking, I enjoyed the story of 2 quite a bit. I enjoyed the endings, and I enjoyed how it felt a little more personal as a result, with even more options to choose from. Though, as we explore this narrative and move through the city of Rapture, it's important to keep your mind on things like difficulty and New Game Plus, so I want to talk a little bit about that next. Now, difficulty, we basically have easy through hard, and the game does not actually have a New Game Plus mode, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, given how short this game is. Gonna run you roughly 10 to 12 hours, I would say. It's a little bit shorter than the first one, and due to some of the gameplay changes, I'd also argue it's a little bit easier. For instance, playing through this game on hard mode was much easier than playing through the first one on survivor. But there is no New Game Plus mode, so if you want to see the other endings, you either need to start from the beginning or load up a previous save to make some different decisions. Now from there I want to talk about progression systems, of which there are not particularly many, basically down to weapons as well as your upgrades via plasmids and tonics. As we are playing as a Big Daddy, we have a different selection of weapons available to us from the first game, namely our melee weapon is now our drill, which has a charged spin attack that requires fuel to use, but we also see the addition of other weapons such as a rivet gun or a spear gun, each of which can be used in a variety of ways. But exactly like the first game, we can upgrade these by finding one-use stations and upgrading our weapons up to 3 times to do things like increase their ammo capacity, reduce recoil, add an extra effect. Exactly what depends on which weapon you're using, but these are upgradable. The other side of progression is plasmids and tonics. As we are in the gene-altering world of BioShock, we can find various plasmids which will alter our DNA, effectively giving us forms of superpowers, with plasmids being the active abilities and tonics being the passive abilities. Now, in order to buy either plasmid or tonics, we have to collect Adam, and this works substantially differently than it did in the first game because we are playing as a Big Daddy now, and it is typically their job to protect the little sisters. And this is a bit more involved than it was previously. Now, in order to get a hold of a little sister, we first have to kill the Big Daddy accompanying her, as we did previously, but once that's done, we can choose to either adopt or harvest this little sister. Harvest will give us more Adam immediately, but can affect the ending, of course. Adopting the little sisters is also an option, but you'll get your Adam much more slowly because we don't just get Adam for saving the little sister. Rather, we then have to take that sister to various bodies for her to collect Adam from, which will then be passed on to us. After using that little sister for 2 separate gathers, we need to return her to a vent and can, one final time, choose whether or not to harvest them. And while harvesting will get you more Adam, every few little sisters that you save will present you with a gift which gives you extra Adam to make up the difference. So while what you will accumulate Adam-wise winds up being in roughly the same place, either way, what you are sacrificing here is a bit of your time in order to not kill the little sisters, but again, this affects the ending as well, which I feel is a more substantial choice than what was presented in BioShock 1 from a gameplay perspective. Now, narratively, it winds up having much the same effects, being good or bad, but the difference here is that in addition to the changes gameplay-wise and how this works, BioShock 2 also has other choices for you to make, which made all of this feel much more impactful. However, once you have your Adam, you simply take this to a gatherer's garden and spend it on the various upgrades you would like, which can include things like simple health upgrades, Eve, which effectively acts as your mana for your plasmids, new plasmids themselves, or simply gene tonic slots, which will give you more slots for you to use your passive abilities. Overall, though, a pretty straightforward, simple system that hinges a lot on the integration of the narrative systems as well. That naturally leans into the combat, though, and this is where the game feels much more impactful than the first BioShock. The original BioShock, which is pushing 16 years old now, has much floatier combat than this one. Combat in 2 has much more impact as well as simply more options available to you, which is really helped along by the fact that you can sort of dual wield both a plasmid and a weapon at the same time. Though there is admittedly still some awkwardness in the melee animations, though it is much better than the first one here as well. Another big improvement by and large is that the AI saw some tweaks on top of all that. See, the AI in BioShock 1 used to kind of just mindlessly charge you, which would lead to a lot of underwhelming situations where oftentimes it was difficult to use the options that have been given to you via plasmids, but much of that seems to be taken into account in the sequel. Because here we see enemies play around much more with what they are actually good at. For instance, enemies with guns typically won't run right up to you. Melee enemies will, but this tends to be a more hit and run situation where they'll usually hit you and then try to back off into some cover. And that combined with a few more enemy types added as well that also behave a bit differently from the first game, I think certainly adds some weight to the combat. And that's before we even start talking about the various things like using the appropriate weapon at the right time and the various ammo types therein, many of which give us options to set up defenses, which I think is especially important in a game where we are often put in charge of defending a point, such as a little sister gathering Adam. And that makes things like being able to use our hacking tool to throw out mini turrets as an alternative option, or use our spear gun to set up electrified tripwires, or use our rivet gun to set up basically small landmines, a pretty valuable piece of the experience. And a lot of that together has you oftentimes thinking about the best way to handle a situation and what tactics you can employ to do so, rather than it just being a bit of a mindless shooting fest, which I think befits a game like this a bit more. Which I think is really shown off in the fights against the Big Sisters, one of the big new enemy types. And Big Sisters are an evolution in the gathering and procurement of Adam. Little sisters that grow up become Big Sisters, whose job it is to hunt down the Adam thieves, or basically splicers who got lucky and actually managed to get some Adam from little sisters underneath Big Daddies. We ourselves will be fighting a few, of course, and Big Sisters spawn every time you clear out the little sisters present in a level. You'll have to fight one. And because of that, you often know when these fights are coming, which allows you to prepare for them, and they get progressively more difficult as the game goes on, largely due to their ability to soak a lot of damage and employ hit and run tactics. Oftentimes they'll engage you in melee, do some damage, back off, use plasmids to throw things at you, dash in for other hits, jump off of walls, etc. They're a very fast and agile enemy, and they really promote thinking on your feet as a result. And all of that before we've even mentioned hacking. Now, security-wise, the game remains much the same in that we can occasionally trigger alarms which will send security bots after us, or we might run into various turrets which will fire on us, and we can get around this by hacking. Early on, we're introduced to a hacking tool that functions a bit differently than it did in the original title, with a very frustrating mini-game being replaced rather with a more on-the-fly function, specifically one that can be done at range. while we can still hack things by getting up close to them, now we have a weapon of sorts that will be given hacking darts for, and to accommodate that change, the hacking minigame has been changed to a timing-based minigame, where accidentally clicking on red will give you a security threat, where security bots will swarm you, setting off the alarm, as opposed to clicking it on green, which is where you want it, but also there can potentially be blue as well, which will give you an extra reward if you can hit that, or you might just miss altogether, which will simply deal some damage to you. And while that minigame is very simple, doing it in the midst of combat potentially adds a certain dynamic element that is both quicker and more interesting than the minigame that was at play previously. So all of that to tell you that they really did a fantastic job of integrating new gameplay elements into it while still retaining most of the feel of that original title as well. It still very much so feels like I'm playing BioShock, but minus a lot of the annoyances. That though does bring us to the world and gameplay section. As I've already mentioned, we are exploring the city of Rapture, but specifically new areas of Rapture. And many of the areas of the city that we actually explore this time around, I think explore concepts of how the city functioned prior to its downfall, which is especially interesting against the backdrop of what the city is supposed to stand for. Having been built by Andrew Ryan as this sort of monument to self-empowerment, very much so on the philosophical lines of someone like Ayn Rand, but when that vision and philosophy comes into conflict with Sophia Lamb, who is more of a collectivist, who is more about the group than the individual, it leads to a lot of situations where both of these people prove what they're willing to do in order to win, essentially, even if it runs counter to the ideals they espouse, which I think is especially prevalent in the area called Persephone, which turns out to be a secret prison of sorts, and both the existence of that area as well as how it was ran offers up a lot of interesting philosophical questions of how these people believed, if they even adhered to the things they preached, so to speak, which was certainly very interesting. And in that way, I think BioShock 2 retains its atmosphere while at the same time managing to be more sinister, especially when we're walking underwater, as Big Daddies are encased in diving suits, and there are several sections of the game where we will be walking under the ocean, and while you're not actually in any real danger in these sections, if anything, they serve as a bit of a breather, ironically, it still sort of encapsulates that feeling of oppressive pressure and the environment itself being dangerous, even if there isn't a threat present. However, I will say one thing in terms of the gameplay and world that I think BioShock 2 struggles with isn't even necessarily its fault. It's simply that we are exploring a place we've already been, and while the focus might be a little different, it's simply hard to impress someone as much the second time around. And whereas the first game had a lot of these big reveals and was your first experience to this sort of oppressive atmosphere that was almost metaphorical, with its descent into the ocean representing a descent into madness for the people who lived in Rapture, not really being present here in the second game because that's stuff we already know. And because of all those things, the game can give off this sort of I've been here, done this kind of vibe, which I couldn't help but feel throughout the experience. Nonetheless, Rapture remains as much of a character as the rest of the actual characters, and it is an atmosphere and a city that is especially interesting. On a more mechanical level, unlike BioShock 1, there isn't really any retreading old ground. It's a very linear experience. We move from level to level, with each one offering the chance for us to scrounge for supplies, find some secrets, earn resources off of enemies we defeat, all of which can be spent at various vending machines. The vending machines can be hacked to give us things like free items or discounts. But one thing that was removed was the crafting stations from the first title, though in fairness, I don't really feel like they lost much there. If anything, they just moved the resources you were getting from that into the environment or onto enemies, so I still think it works out pretty well. Beyond all of that, though, we still see the environmental interactions with various elemental plasmids on surfaces like oil or water, but much of the scenery and things like that are things we'll have seen and recognized from the first game, and the game doesn't really move the needle much in that regard. But that brings us to our DLC section, and there is a little bit of DLC to be aware of here, primarily the Protector's Trials and Minerva's Den. The Protector Trials trials are very straightforward. You simply protect a little sister while she gathers Adam, and the better you do this, the higher score you'll get. And doing enough of these will unlock some sort of cut development content, things like old concept art, trailers that never quite made it to release, that kind of thing. And it offers a few extra hours of gameplay, but nothing to really write home about. The showpiece here is really Minerva's Den, which is a fantastic piece of DLC. I don't want to spoil it too much for anyone who might want to play it, but it's a very almost intimate story about some of the finer points of Rapture and how it works. Specifically, the man in charge of the high-tech portion of the city who created the Thinker, the computer that runs a lot of the automation involved in Rapture, things like recycling the air, managing pressure, etc. But in the DLC, we play as Subject Sigma, the 18th of the Alpha series of Big Daddies, who is sent here by a recurring character, Bridget Tenenbaum, to receive blueprints from the Thinker that will hopefully allow people to return the Big Daddies to their natural human state instead of these almost monstrosities that they've been turned into. Though, needless to say, it gets a little more complicated than that, and the story at play here is really, really good. If anything, I think Minerva's Den is like the perfect encapsulation of a BioShock narrative, where it's not quite as long as games 1 and 2, of course, but manages to tell a very distinct narrative experience that the twist at the end really caught me off guard with, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. It's really a fantastic piece of DLC, and certainly a memorable one at that. That, though, does bring us to our Steam Deck section of the video. Officially, this game has a rating of playable on Steam Deck, though for the most part, I would say I didn't really run into any problems. The playable rating notes that you might have issues with text in certain places being either too small or requiring the keyboard, but I never really ran into those issues, and at one point, the 2K launcher added last year was preventing it from loading up on the Steam Deck, but that has apparently been fixed. So otherwise, I had a pretty good time with this on Steam Deck. I don't necessarily like playing games like this with a controller personally, but it does have controller support, so you don't really have to set up controls or anything. The game runs well. With it being an older title, you don't really have to mess around with graphical settings too much. So while playing an FPS might not be my first choice for a Steam Deck, if you wanted to do that, it's a pretty enjoyable experience, and I didn't run into any issues with it. Which naturally leads us to our positives and negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. Now, on the positive side of things, the enhanced gameplay from the original is very welcome. My main problem with the original BioShock when I played it recently was that the combat in particular was very floaty. It lacked a lot of weight, enemies just charged you, and I found the combat of that game wasn't wildly fun, frankly. But much of that has been improved here, and that on top of a narrative that provides more substantial choice than the first game as well. I think this game has a lot going for it in both of those regards, which made it a little bit of a surprise to me that this one is held in such lower regard in comparison to the first one. Because when it comes to negatives for this title, I really don't have much. I guess if I had to give one big complaint for this, it would simply be that it's probably too close to the original BioShock. While they certainly addressed the biggest problems from the original, it also doesn't really feel like they iterated or added much to it outside of a different story otherwise, which can make the gameplay feel like you're simply playing an enhanced version of the original, rather than a full-blown sequel. And with all of that said, we arrive at our conclusion. Now, with this game being 13 years old, I know you're on the edge of your seat waiting for my recommendation one way or the other of one of the most positively reviewed series of all time, so I won't leave you in suspense. Yes, I would recommend BioShock 2. In fact, in many ways, I much prefer BioShock 2 to the original. The narrative is more my speed, and while it might lack the bigger moments from that first game that were kind of showstoppers, so to speak, BioShock 2 has a lot of things that I prefer more personally, such as story choices that then lead to various endings, choice and consequence. Gameplay that is enjoyable to play. Many of the improvements here were simply much more engaging than their iteration in the original, and because of all those things, for me, I've got to say I prefer BioShock 2 in terms of 1 and 2. I haven't played Infinite yet, so we'll see, but in my opinion, BioShock 2 is the better game, even if its story isn't quite as memorable. So with a game that is easy to pick up on sale, bundled with a collection that includes all 3 games, I think it's definitely worth checking out if you personally haven't already, like myself had not. But just BioShock 2 Remastered is like $20, and the collection of the remastered versions is at full price $60. You'd still get your money's worth even at that price, but it does go on sale pretty regularly these days, so bear that in mind. That, though, is going to do it for me today. I certainly hope you enjoyed this review. I had a lot of fun playing through it and experiencing it for myself, which makes me incredibly curious on how BioShock Infinite is going to go, because I know that game is also very beloved. So if you enjoyed this review or you're looking forward to my future review of Infinite, do remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, and certainly tell me how you feel about BioShock 2 down below as well. But regardless of all of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.